Greetings and welcome to Zord's Modified Space Program Season 2, Episode 2. We are finally getting on our way on a proper mission. This is the launch of the communications network, much the same as the start of the first season of this, where we are sending up a few satellites on a manned mission because we don't have any established communications network. And we're going to place them in a circular orbit around the equator, and we're going to do it with an elliptic orbit which has a period which is a specific ratio to the circular orbit. In this case it is 2/3 of that orbit. As I said, and as you can see, this mission is manned. We have Jebediah. His capsule is inside the fairing because of aerodynamics. It's easiest that way. And we can see results of the mods. I'm using tweak scale to modify the size of the stock tanks, which have modded fuel in them, but they're still the stock tanks. Let's see. Yeah, we're making a progressed orbit. Let's just appreciate how beautiful this Earth is. This image of the Earth. So it's a step up from Kerbin. Even though Kerbin looks great, you can't really beat the Earth. So as I said, we have the stock tanks in different sizes. So the fact that I have an orange fuel tank in the first stage doesn't really mean anything, because it could be however small or big I wanted it to be. In this case, it is huge. It has like 100,000 units each of oxidizer and fuel. Staging. Getting rid of lots of fairings and the first stage, but this quarter of the top fairing decided to stick along, so I tried to shake it off, but it's hanging in there, and well, yeah, I think it's safest to just bring it along. So yeah, I said tweak scale. I'm using tweak scale instead of the tool that was included in real fuels in earlier releases, when you could stretch your tanks. Just stretch your tanks. Continue from the mod stretch your tanks. I could use that with what's that called? Tweak everything, rescale something. But I'm using tweak scale because that was the one I got to work. Look, we have orbit, which is an achievement in this level of difficulty. It's not trivial getting it orbit anymore. Which is part of the reason why this episode is 1 week delayed, one could say. So now we need to set up this elliptical orbit. See if we can finally get rid of this fairing. Yeah, it's not coming back. Then we have our 3 communication satellites, very nicely packed on top of the capsule here. So we're going to use this very small fuel tank, the 3rd stage, to bring us up to this orbit and hopefully back in one piece. As I said, the fuel tanks are no longer free-form stretch. You can just make them whichever size you want. I'm now I have chosen to use stock fuel tanks, but with a tweakable scale. So you're still as free, basically. It just takes a little thinking. So we now have this elliptical orbit set up. It took a while, accelerating a bit less than 1 g, and we needed a little more than 1 kilometer per second to make this happen. So now the plan is that we warp out to apoapsis, let one of the satellites go, and it will accelerate on its own to circularize its orbit. And all the satellites therefore have a rather large fuel tank. In fact, the fuel tank is about twice the size of what it needs to be. This is partly to have the margins on the correct side, and partly because when I built these, I made them sub-assemblies, and I built them with half the fuel tank. That's how I built them and saved them. But I don't know if it's a bug, or if it's a bug in the mods or something else, or if it's just not an implemented feature yet. But when I loaded the sub-assemblies, they had full fuel, and it didn't happen that way. But we're out here, and almost all the hard work is done. The only thing left that is a negative impact of the heavy payload is the amount of delta V we have left in the third stage to get back, and that shouldn't be a problem really. So we have detached our first satellite. It should be communicating, if not directly to the ground, then to the parent spacecraft, and then to the ground, but it appears these long Omni antennas have range enough to reach ground stations, of which there are plenty now that I have used one of the pre-made settings files for remote tech, which implements lots of these, it really makes it a lot easier than to have a single point on the surface where information is taken in. Our satellite is now working its way to circularize its own orbit. The periapsis and apoapsis is supposed to be at 6,500 kilometers, 6,500,000 meters. This is because I did some math, and in this scenario where we have basically a circle, which is the Earth, and a triangle, which is the satellite constellation, which needs to encompass the circle because the satellites need to see each other above the horizon, then the height of the corner of the triangle from the edge of the circle is equal to the radius of the circle. You need some intermediate trigonometry to figure this out, but it's fascinating, the connections that exist in these mathematical structures. So the first satellite, the Komsat 1, is in position. We have adjusted the orbit of the parent spacecraft because the periapsis was a bit too low, and we are now waiting one orbit, at which point the Komsat 1 should have done 2/3 of its orbit, which we saw was the case, and we can now release Komsat 2 at approximately 120 degrees of separation, which is exactly what we planned. So same. This time we're gonna do a maneuver node, just in case. And yeah, as I said, same. This thing is going to spend 1,000 meters per second to circularize its own orbit, and it's going to look exactly like it did for the last one. So I'm just going to skip it. So there we have Komsat 2 deployed, and it's tweaking the orbit. We don't get this one quite circular, but it doesn't actually matter. As long as the semi-major axis is as close to 6,500 kilometers as possible, the purpose should be fulfilled. Now, the radius of the Earth is approximately 6,390 kilometers, if I remember correctly. So I just round that up, because there is going to be oscillation, because non-perfect circular orbits, even the ones that I think I get quite perfectly circular, are not going to be perfect enough. And the satellites are going to drift and all kinds of unpredictability. So you round up and you get 6,500 kilometers as a height of the orbit. And now the satellites should, in theory, be able to see all the other satellites in the constellation above the horizon, but it won't actually matter if they don't, because all these satellites are capable of communicating with the ground independently of each other, and as long as one of them have connection to the spacecraft or the space probe, then the connection will be established, because at almost any point along the orbit, any satellite have connection to a ground station. So yeah, it's more forgiving, and I hope it works. We'll see by maybe next week. For now, we have the problem of how to get Jebediah back. You see, the engine igniter mod has fuel flow simulation in the tanks, and if you are in freefall, then you don't have any fuel flow to your engines, which means you can't start them, which is something I was aware of, but I thought I had circumvented it, or maybe it just wasn't active. I have the Zapatrons, they're used, and their purpose was to push the fuel down to the bottom of the fuel tank, down to the engines, which they did for the first ignition. Now that we're going home, they're spent. So what I did, accidentally, was that I set a spin on the capsule, and the centrifugal force, which is imaginary but you can still feel it, it pushes the fuel out and thus to the engines, which starts the engines, except one of them, which I managed to shut down with the thrust limiter, making the capsule spin even more. And well, as you saw, eventually I got control over it and managed to point it in roughly the right direction. This was just the first of many possibly critical design flaws of this spacecraft. The second is that I had no idea that it was actually going to point the right way down during atmospheric re-entry. I was lucky, and it did, so the heat shield managed to save Jebediah's life, but, as you saw, the parachutes were not covered by the heat shield, which is entirely my fault, and well, I learned that now. Not much of a comfort for Jebediah, who is in a single-part spacecraft flying over the Pacific Ocean, close to the Midway Islands. Is that them? And he's got no parachutes, and frankly a very, very slim hope of survival. How is Jebediah gonna get out of this one? I mean, he usually survives everything. I mean, to be fair, he should have survived everything up to this point, otherwise he wouldn't be here, right? So how is he gonna get out of this one? Well, I've seen people have their Kerbals eject just in the moment before impact. Now, this was over land, but, you know, I am kind of out of ideas, so let's try it. Oh! He did survive. I don't think that was how I planned that this would happen, but, well, he's alive, floating in his spacesuit in the middle of the Pacific. I hope they have planes and boats nearby. I can't recover him because I don't have the altimeter, but okay. So it's well, I just try and go to Space Center and see if he's still there when I get to the tracking station. And he is, and I can recover him. So mission successful. Satellites deployed, and Jebediah Kerman survived. That's good enough for the start, and I hope to see you next week for the continuation. Goodbye!